Hello, everyone, and welcome to all of you who've come here on this Friday afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Parvati Raghuram. I'm professor of the Open University, and I'm currently leading the anti-racism working group activities across Imiscoe, the network of migration research institutes across Europe and beyond. So the anti-racism working group has come together over concerns that in the summer and with the outpourings which related to the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, which arose after that. In thinking through, I think it was a important moment for everybody because everybody thought about what is our role in this, what is our participation, what do we need to do, and Imiscoe did precisely that. It rose to that challenge and in fact led on that by actually doing a whole set of changes and initiatives on this. And one of those is the importance of actually looking back at questions of the relationship between race and migration. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we address this intellectually, but also through our own institution. And we've had some really excellent support from across the Imiscoe network for this. So really, this is a collective endeavor of every person in the institution, in the network, but particularly in the anti-racism working group. So as part of that, one of the things that Marco suggested, and here I have to say that he has led significantly on thinking through the format and ideas around this, along with Anders and several others. And we've put together a series of 3 seminars where we are thinking through what is that relationship between race and racism and migration. And we are really happy to have you all here today, and we look forward to a really interesting intellectual engagement. I'll just repeat again that the seminar is being recorded, will be made available online. So if you do not want to be to be seen, then do switch off your cameras. Otherwise, it will be great to have you here. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Marco, and thanks so much, Marco. And thanks particularly to Leek and for the many others who've done a lot of work to set this all up. Thanks. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you very much, Parvati, and thanks to Imiscoe. I think it's a very good idea to start to address those issues that for some reason have been absent for too long in our network. And so for today's session, actually, there are 2 sub-sessions. We have decided to have conversations between scholars, 2 by 2, and we sort of decided to group the countries in, of course, maybe a disputable way, but we wanted to maybe to get out of the traditional oppositions between France and the UK, for example, when we deal about those issues. So the first hour today, we are going to discuss the situation in the Netherlands and in the UK. And in the second hour, we will discuss the French case and the Italian case. I will briefly introduce the speakers of the first session, and I will do the same for the second subsession. So to talk about, to speak about the Netherlands, we have Darshan Vigneswaran. He's the co-director of the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies at the University of Amsterdam, and he's also assistant professor in the Department of Political Science in the same university. And to talk about the British case, we have Leon Moussavi, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology, Social Policy and Criminology at the University of Liverpool. But I understand that he's currently the director of the University of Liverpool in Singapore. But I have no idea where Leon is physically at this very moment. He will tell us. So I would like to start this conversation by, we have a set of questions in order to facilitate this exchange. The first one maybe relates to history. We should not assume that all of us know what the history is in each of the countries. What are the main historical elements underpinning race and racism in the Netherlands and in the UK? Who wants to start? Darshan or Leon? You can choose.
Sure, I'm
Okay.
happy to jump in. Thanks, Marco, and thanks to the organisers of this series. It comes at a really important time, and I'm glad to be a part of it. I'm just going to start off with a quick caveat: is that I'm not a researcher on the Netherlands as such. I'm a researcher in the Netherlands who mostly studies South Africa, India, other parts of the developing world, and I'm also not a scholar of race and racism. I am someone who rather reflects on, and will talk today a little bit about my own experience in addressing and coming across situations in the Netherlands as both a scholar in the Netherlands and observing these issues. And in terms of history, I think I rely a lot upon my colleagues, and particularly the work of Gloria Becker on this issue in the Netherlands, who's written a fantastic book called White Innocence. I'm going to start with Duke University Press, and I'm going to put it in the chat box in a second. And her take on this issue in the Netherlands is one which speaks a lot about the difficulties surrounding the subject of race, racism, and the difficulties involved in introducing those terms in public debate and discussions of Dutch history. She reviews the past as something, or the Dutch past as something that has been largely told, and the story of racism as something that was done by others to others, and never by the Dutch to their own, right? And that in particular stories about the racism involved in the years of the Holocaust, during the occupation, during the Second World War, as something that features prominently in that discussion. And on the other side, we have this story and this narrative of Dutch nationalism as the corrector of historical wrongs, particularly in their efforts to address apartheid in South Africa, and also in their more recent efforts to build a set of institutions in The Hague around the prosecution of war criminals and other perpetrators of historical wrongs related to race. And I think these series of actions and these series of images and memories, and so maybe I'm not quite getting at the story of history, but these memories powerfully impact upon the way in which the discussion has been presented in the Netherlands and addressed. And in the next question, I'll sort of move on to talk about how that has impacted on the terms of debate.
Yeah. Thank you. Leon? How about the UK? Everybody pretends to know the UK, but I'm not sure it is right, though.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Excellent. Yep. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I feel overwhelmed to be here in such an event, because talking about something like racism is a big responsibility, because there is so much to say about racism in relation to what has happened in the past, but also what is happening today. And I would say that, excuse me, there's probably nobody who's qualified enough to be able to comprehensively explain and examine racism in any country, because it's, like I say, a concept or a phenomena or a social sort of a process which has been so impactful on world history and human society in so many different ways. So my expertise is only about one specific small area of racism. And I would like to say, even though sometimes when I write my biography for events and so on, I sometimes broadly call myself a sociologist of race, even though I might describe myself as such, in fact, my expertise doesn't allow for the sort of comprehensive understanding of racism that we want to have. And that's because, as I'm trying to say, racism is such a huge issue, and there's so much to say about it. So I will try to provide something that's useful to the audience by way of answering some of the questions that were provided to us. So I'll start with the first question that you've posed, which was, what are the main historical elements underpinning race and racism? Well, I know I'm supposed to kind of talk about the UK, but as I think it would be evident from other things that you've read or heard, when we talk about race and racism, it's something that, yes, has its own national specificities and its own story within national context. But of course, it's a project which is transnational or transcultural and which is global and globalized. So what I say will not really be unique to the UK. It's something that you will find in many other places and countries and spaces. So there's three things. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I need to be concise for once. But there's three things that come to mind for me when I ask what are the historical elements that underpin race and racism. And those three things that I'll briefly touch upon are, number one, colonialism, number two, pseudoscience, and number three, let's call it Christendom. Okay, so let me just elaborate very briefly on those 3 points, which I would say underpin race and racism in the UK, but obviously beyond that as well. So number one, as we know, colonialism was a process which was all about conquering and domination, and which is a story which cannot be understood without understanding the ways in which humans were classified and humans were categorized as some being superior and some being inferior, which is basically along the lines of race or racial typologies, or something along the lines of some type of human classification, which is usually what we're calling race and racism. So as we know, colonialism was the era in which race was globalized in a way in which we hadn't seen before, but specifically globalized in a way where the white person or the European person, or perhaps even the Christian person, it gets a bit complicated when we add religion, but religion is kind of part of the story of race as well, becomes seen as superior to those who are not European or not white or not Christian or even specific types of Christian. So the idea of empire, if we want to talk, I mean, I don't know how much this is true in other countries which were colonizing powers, but the idea of empire in the UK was and still is, I would suggest, extremely important for understanding one's own identity as a, let's say, a Briton or a Christian or a white person or a European or as someone who's so-called civilized. And the idea of expanding, not only for the sake of territory, but for imperialistic conquest and forcing one's religion and culture and way of life and systems onto others was a key criteria which has underpinned the racism that we still see today. And this is very important because some people will say, well, the Persians colonized, the Japanese colonized, the Incas colonized, whoever colonized. There's been many colonial histories. What we respond to such comments is that, well, we don't still live in the era, at least in Europe, let's say, where, let's say, Japanese colonialism, for example, or Persian colonialism or Byzantine colonialism is still shaping the hierarchies and the ways in which people are thinking about one another. So in other words, that's why some people talk about coloniality, because they want to say colonialism hasn't ended. Okay, I'm talking too much. Secondly, biological, pseudo-biological or pseudoscientific conceptions of race were very important in understanding the history of race and racism, because it was this kind of Enlightenment obsession, which I mentioned previously with classification, that leads to theories about who has evolved from who and who is the sort of who's the society and the people of the group and the so-called civilization who's progressed the most. And this is a key thing to study if we want to understand racism, because fundamentally scholars and knowledgeable people, supposedly people like ourselves, they were the ones who were often providing the foundations for race and racism, because racism comes out of race and race comes out of so-called science. And therefore scientists, knowledge makers, people like us in the elite spaces of reading and writing and talking were actually creating race and racism. So what are we going to do about that is a question for those of us who've inherited the legacy of academia or scholarship or knowledge. And third and finally, I also like to throw out this idea of Christendom, or even Europe, if you want to call it something slightly different. But these two things are very much intertwined, because basically what I would suggest, and it's not just me who would say this, but other scholars who are experts on this topic would say that basically the idea of Europe or the idea of Christendom is very much associated with the idea of a unique and specific civilization which is occupied by a group of people with particular traits who are more enlightened or more developed or superior, however you want to put it, than people who are heathens or people who are uncivilized or people who are barbaric. And that even predates, those notions predate even colonialism, when we talk about things like the Crusades, which is something that, again, it's not just a UK thing, but this idea of having to conquer and reclaim and dominate and impose. All of these ideas are also important for understanding modern race and racism. But each one of these three things could be a lecture in themselves. So obviously it's so complicated, and that's why I said at the outset, I'm not really well equipped to give the full, thorough details that you need to know about all of these things, because each one in and of itself is a specific expertise which requires hundreds of years of studying, because there's so much to say about it. And I'm sorry, this is already a lecture for one question.
No, thank you very much, Leon. I think it's thank you to Darshan as well. Very important to root our knowledge in history, but then we have to move also to the contemporary situation. And here we notice that the terms of the debates, both the political debates, the public debate, and the scientific debates on race and racism in connection or not to immigration, are a bit different. So Darshan, what are the terms of the debate in the land of toleration that was, in the Roman National Néerlandais? Toleration is part of, it's a big myth. How is it going now? Don't forget your mic.
I think to a certain extent, as you're alluding to, there are no terms, right? In that there's a profound reluctance to utilize and to allow for the utilization of these terms in not only public discourse, public discussions of these issues, but also scholarly ones. And I'm glad that Leon's drawn our attention to questions of epistemology and our responsibility in the construction of racial categories and knowledge about race and racism. Because this is something that we've been addressing and seeking to, or confronting in our efforts to work through these issues in the Netherlands for some time. And one of the things that I guess I could just provide you with a couple of examples to illustrate. And one of the things that you referred to earlier, Marco, is that Imiscoe as a network has had this sort of absence of discussions of race and racism in our network, and a curious absence. And I would argue that some of that has to do with, some of that is my fault, right? And that as the representative of the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies, one of the founding organizations in this network, we used to have a mandate which specifically covered issues of race, and for some reason, I'm not really familiar with the history, that's been papered over, and we've even been renamed in a way that reduces the significance of that category. And I think that has to do with this effort and this willingness to present issues of race and racism via proxy in Dutch discussions, and not get to the core of the structural forms of discrimination that exist. And if I could just give you another example of how this impacts, and how this affects public discussion and academic discussion, because I think it's hard to grasp for an outsider. So I've been trying to make this argument within my own department for some time, a political science department at the University of Amsterdam, that we need to be paying attention to more of these issues, not as simply out there, but also within our department itself. And I did that in one of our departmental meetings with sort of a difficult analogy, right? By saying, one of the confronting things for me working in this political science department in Amsterdam is that the ratio of janitorial and cafeteria staff in our department, black to white, the ratio between janitorial and cafeteria staff to professors is equivalent to what I saw when I was working in post-apartheid South Africa. Now, that was a very difficult point for many of my colleagues, I think, to swallow and to see, right, to have what is a patently racial form of discrimination presented as something that we may have responsibility for, that we may be involved in constituting, is not simply, difficult to be sort of, I guess, made aware of, but difficult to stomach and take responsibility for. And I'll talk a little bit more about, I think, how we've been changing and addressing those issues, but that's sort of what I'm getting at in terms of this difficulty of putting race on the agenda.
Thank you, Darshan. Leon, going back to the UK, I remember there was a time when the UK was presented as sort of the vanguard in anti-racism legislation with the Race Relation Acts and so on, but also in terms of theorization with people like Geroy and Miles, and before that, Michael Banton and Rex, with all the disputes and controversies. And now we are in a post-Brexit situation. How is the debate in the UK today?
Well, just going back to what you said at the outset about where am I? I'm in Singapore right now, by the way. I've been here for close to 9 years now. So I'm kind of a little bit out of touch, and I'm deliberately trying to be out of touch because the debates over there are kind of quite frustrating and depressing. But what I can say in response to the question about what are the terms, if I've understood the question correctly, what terms of theoretical public debate? I mean, the first thing I'd say about academia, I do feel as though within academia, and we have to be careful because obviously nobody works within like UK academia. Like all of us are reading scholarship from wherever it's coming from. We're not just reading British authors, like we're reading from wherever we can find relevant information. But the academic scene in the UK with regards to race and racism, in my opinion, is fantastic in the sense that there is lots of excellent scholarship, very sophisticated scholarship, I would say, being produced about race and racism and all different angles, whether it's to do with, I don't know, mixed race experiences or whiteness or race in academia or race in education or race in the criminal justice system or intersectional approach. There's so many great scholars and scholarship and activists as well, which sometimes there's people in both camps. In broader academia, I would say that, there isn't as much attention towards racism as what there should be, because as I said, in my opinion, it's an extremely important sort of tangent upon which society is hinged upon. But in the specific areas of expertise, I think it's thriving, as it is in many places. Our understanding of race and racism and the way it manifests in different institutions and different everyday experiences is phenomenal. We understand it extremely well, so well that sometimes I'm reading literature about race and racism, and I'm saying, we know this and we've been talking about this for many years. But that's when it comes to the question of what are the terms of the debate in the public and in the public sphere. And that's where the answer is very different, because, there's no easy way of answering this because it's quite a subjective assessment to try and assess what's the debate like and how much awareness is there. I would say that the debate in the UK, which I imagine is the same in many other places, is characterized around, I'll mention two particular characteristics of the public debate about race and racism, which has been there all the time, but has come to the fore in 2020 when racism suddenly became something that people want to talk about. And the first of those two things is this notion that talking about race and racism in public, in the media, in social media, for example, or with your friends or wherever you socialize, is akin to political correctness. I'm not sure if that's a term which is used in other national contexts, but usually when people raise race or racism, say this is racist, this is not acceptable, or we need to talk about racism, people say or think, well, this is just political correctness gone mad, as they say. This is someone with like a chip on their shoulder, as they also say, like someone who's kind of exaggerating and blowing things out of proportion. And the problem is not as bad as what it is claimed to be. So I have these discussions all the time with friends, with family, with colleagues, with different people, and many people think I'm just kind of, harping on about the same old things, and I probably am, to be fair to them. But many people think we don't really need to talk about race and racism, at least not to the extent that some of us who pay attention to it want to talk about it, because they think it is an exaggeration and it's just being politically correct. It's just trying to be, the more modern way of saying that, the more recent way of saying that is to say it's just you trying to be woke, or it's just you trying to, as they say, virtue signal. Like these are new ways of saying political correctness gone mad, which is an old way of dismissing racism. And the second thing I would say about how racism is understood in the public and in the public sphere is that racism is understood, and this is not just amongst, let's call them, lay people or people who have, not read about racism. This is amongst people who are in powerful positions, whether in the media or in politics or even in academia, who understand race and racism as being about violence and aggression and overt sort of racial slurs. And what, as we know in the academic literature, we're talking about for a long time, is that racism doesn't just appear in your face. It does, it can, and it does. And it has been like that in the past, in particular, and it's still like that in many instances today. I mean, you mentioned George Floyd. I mean, that's that's the most starkest example that all of us have been kind of almost traumatized by. But what we also know about racism is that it operates in very discreet, subtle ways, and sometimes indirect ways. It's often unspoken, but it doesn't mean it's not there. And so in the public, even though this is very well understood amongst experts and people in academia who specialize in race, in the wider public, I would suggest that people haven't been able to grasp this notion. And that's why if you sort of talk about something like microaggression or institutional racism, people are not convinced about that and they're not comfortable with that. So I would say that basically the public sphere has a lot of catching up to do with regards to race and racism. And I don't know, again, Brexit is not only a lecture. Brexit is a course. It's a whole degree we can do on Brexit. But there's obviously lots to say about Brexit and race and racism. And I think to me it's very obvious that Brexit is not just about race and racism and xenophobia. But you can't understand Brexit, if we're honest, without also having some sense of what are those historical legacies of, like we talked about, empire, for example, or even the Crusades, or even even let's go talk about World War II, and there's the tropes that still remain about rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, and this kind of nationalism and this idea that the UK is at the forefront of having this huge empire and innovation and leading the way and all these kind of things, which somehow has some resonance with racism and xenophobia, which needs to be theorized, can't be dismissed like some people want to dismiss it. But it isn't the only explanation, of course, for Brexit, because Brexit is complicated. It means different things to different people, and to some people it means multiple things.
Thank you very much. Well, another issue, and maybe especially for us academics and researchers, is that it's not always easy to document racial and ethnic discrimination, because also we rely on data that are available or that we are allowed to construct, and also on the methodologies we can use. So in terms of available data, there are huge differences between countries, and also in terms of methodologies. In some countries tests are organized, in others there are some statistics that in France, for example, people call ethnic statistics, that of course are immediately dismissed as being a threat for the Republic. But I'm suppose that Sarah is going to talk about that later. What are the data available? What are the methodologies in the different countries, in your two countries? Darshan, how is it in Holland? Is there a debate about the type of data that are produced or should be produced to better document ethnic and racial discrimination in different areas?
There is a debate. It's really just getting going now. So the Dutch government does collect data on racial identification, but by proxy. It has this statistic called people of a migration background, which many of our colleagues here will be familiar with. It's used in a number of countries. And then the Dutch government then separates between people of a Western or non-Western background. Now, these statistics are hugely problematic. For example, someone from Japan would count as being of a Western background, whereas I would be of a Western background as well, because I'm an Australian national, and that's my migration history, although I'm of South Asian descent. Nonetheless, these statistics are commonly used in a number of quantitative research projects, and I would say that in terms of qualitative research, there's a huge literature on race and racism in the Netherlands, and they don't seem to have these sort of problems in making these sorts of distinctions and understanding the problematic categories involved. But there is a profound reluctance to conduct more extensive forms of quantitative research on these issues. I think probably similarly to the way in which there is a reluctance in France. But precisely because that they're tying these points together, this whole perception of the Dutch experience of race, specifically the story, well, the fact of registration during the Holocaust, and the fact that processes of public registration of people of Jewish faith in public records were then utilized to prosecute the Holocaust, right? And that was a profoundly disturbing event. At present, though, this notion of ethnic registration is being utilized to prevent any form of data collection, any form of quantitative data collection, whether it be survey or otherwise, that involves the use, or whether it involves anonymity, self-identification, any form of data collection that involves the use and application of racial or ethnic categories. And this makes it very difficult to conduct this sort of research into issues of diversity. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that's specifically affected efforts to, I mean, within our department at the UvA to study how we're doing in terms of diversity questions, because there's this profound feeling that any form of data collection of this sort is in some way, by attempting to tackle racism and structural forms of discrimination in this form, you're being a racist, right? By doing this sort of work. So whereas Leon refers to people who talk about racism and race as being politically correct, here this is even a sort of an added twist on that, where any reference to race and an attempt to conduct research into it is somehow now racist, and that's quite odd.
Mm-hmm. Leon, how is it now in the UK? There's a long tradition of, registering ethnicity in the census, with lots of debates over the years. How is the situation now?
So yeah, there are these efforts, but the census only happens every 10 years, and it does generate discussions and scholarship and so on. The next one is due to take place this year, I believe. So, later this year, if the preliminary data comes out, then you might start to get some discussion about how things are changing. And usually, I guess these discussions are characterized by a type of anxiety about, so basically what I would say is that statistics are often not necessarily used to help understand how we can sort of challenge racism, but sometimes they're used maybe in very subtle ways to try to sort of reflect an anxiety about the changing nature of the nation, and not in a positive way. There are also hate crime sort of statistic released by the authorities, which is sort of, when people report having been the victims of racial incidents and so on. But as we know, these statistics are notoriously unreliable because of many things. For example, as I said earlier, lots of racism is covert, it's not explicit. And so people who experience racism or other types of branches of racism, I'm thinking of like Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, things like that, will usually not report it or consider reporting it because they'll have a doubt, even though they sense that it's racism or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or whatever that they've experienced. They will usually feel, I can't really say that because I can't really prove it. So people are usually accused of sort of exaggerating, as we said, racism, but actually I think it's the opposite. People usually don't speak about it and don't talk about it because in a way they can't prove it. They don't have definitive proof, even though they have some intuition or some hint that it was something to do with who they are and how they're racialized or how they are perceived. And even when the racism is explicit, racism is underreported generally because people obviously, they don't feel anything will come of it, or they don't know who to report it to, or they don't trust the people that they can report it to. There are sometimes polls which are conducted, like national polls, which don't usually show things that are quite encouraging. They usually show significant sort of prejudices and anxieties, as I said, about diversity or difference, and particularly with some minorities and what they represent and what they are said to, what challenges they're supposed to pose. Sometimes some questions are asked of minorities, which are also sometimes used to beat those minorities with. And that's why there is a whole politics of surveys and what questions are asked. Sometimes bad questions are asked, sometimes questions that are asked because people know it will generate a headline worthy story that can be manipulated for a sensationalist agenda. There is other data that's produced by government, by local authorities, NGOs produce data, think tanks. One of the things that's quite interesting in the UK, and I'm not sure what the situation is in other countries, but I thought this is a fascinating thing, is that in the UK we have this idea of freedom of information requests, which I'm sure you find it in several countries, but not all countries for sure. And in that is basically something like a legal obligation that public bodies have to release information which is in the public good, something like that. So basically a citizen or a journalist or an academic or whoever can request information from an organization or a public body and say, we would like to know, how many people of this ethnicity are in this position, or how many people have been subject to these types of procedures or sort of hearings or something like that within your organization. So that's quite a useful research tool, which sometimes reveals things that otherwise might not have been known. And then obviously within academia, I think this is true in most places in Europe, I'm not sure though, I'm kind of generalizing, the kind of qualitative research that we usually conduct is mostly characterizing studies on race and racism, although of course there's a lot of quantitative stuff going on as well, but we have so much innovative methods and methodology which are being used, whether it's like the traditional, focus groups and interviews, all the way up to more innovative types of methodology. And one of the ones that I noticed in recent years is becoming quite popular is this notion of autoethnography, which is something to do with basically academics, usually of minorities, different types of minorities, drawing upon their own life and their own experience and their own sort of story and biography to provide a window and an insight into what is going on with regards to race and racism. So there's a lot of different data available, a lot of different methodologies. The problem we have, look, we have a lot of data, we have a lot of methodologies, we have all the knowledge and all the information we need. What we don't have is action. So we don't need to have more methodology and more data. That's what some of the people were saying when they have these kind of hearings and inquiries about race and racism in 2020 and what does it look like, and now we're going to have loads of recommendations. Some people are saying, we did that already. We did it 5 years ago. We did it 10 years ago. We did it 20 years ago. We got all the recommendations. We wrote the executive summary. We told you what to do. Why are you not doing it? So it's kind of like going around in circles. So as you know, we academics and all of us so-called intelligentsia and we so-called thinkers and leaders of society, we're very good at talking and very good at complaining, but I'm not sure that we and the rest of the people in power are good at implementing these things. And I'm not just talking about politicians in terms of implementing these things in the policies of the country. Of course, this is essential and important, but I'm even talking about how we ourselves as individuals interact with and deal with people in our immediate vicinity. So I've written things about this before to do with racism within academia, amongst academics, amongst those of us who claim to be anti-racist, and who, if you ask the academic, what do you think of racism? They'll say it's terrible. But the question is, how are they living their life, and are they living in a consistent way with that? So this is something that, to me, I'm more interested in, to ensure that we who have power, we have a degree of power. What are we doing about racism, rather than just talking about it and thinking about it and researching it? Are we doing something within our life? Are we doing something to encourage people who have more power than us to do something about it? And on this is where we academics are failing, I would say. We're good at thinking, reading, talking, but I'm not sure, and me included, I'm not saying everyone else, I'm talking about myself. We are not as good at doing something to actually turn this knowledge into something beneficial for society.
Thank you. Well, actually, we are just now, the last set of questions deal with change, how we can actually make a change. And when I say we, it's of course us, the research community, but also, trying to connect with the social movements that have emerged. So maybe I would like to reframe the three questions into one and give you the opportunity to talk about, how you see the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement what potential of change do you see, and what role can we play in it as academics? As you just said, Leon, sometimes there's also another thing, we have the impression to be preaching in the desert because nobody listens. Depends also on the national context, but when, for example, you can be a very good academic with very good idea in Hungary, I'm not sure that the Prime Minister of Hungary will be interested in implementing the solutions we would like to offer. So may I ask you, both of you, to reflect on this issue of change and commitment and involvement and connection with the social movements as well. And if we have time, then maybe we can reserve 10 minutes to have some questions from the audience, if this is okay with you. Darshan?
Sure, that's fine. So I think I've got some encouraging things to say for Leon, right? I mean, first of all, somewhat facetiously, I think the Black Lives Matter movement was the first sort of protest movement that academics could not be blamed for experiencing from the comfort of their own home due to social distancing and lockdowns. But on the other side of that, I mean, I think scholars in the Netherlands have been taking a really active role in this, and trying to participate more actively in what was a huge movement in the Netherlands, and one that reflected, I think, some of the greatest traditions of the anti-racism movement. I mean, if we think about anti-racism and protest, there's this strong connection between the tradition and philosophy of nonviolence, how to protest, what protest means, and the anti-racism movement in both its philosophy and also its conduct. And we saw some excellent examples. I mean, some of you would have seen the images from Rotterdam of protest under conditions of social distancing being practiced in its most disciplined and powerful form. Within my own context, we were influenced by what the events in the United States and took it upon ourselves in our department to write a statement about racial injustice, both in the Netherlands and also within our own ranks. And we were incredibly surprised by the powerful response that we received at the time. Some 200 colleagues within our university and another 80 from Leiden were willing to sign the statement. And since then, it's led to a number of changes in the way in which, in our hiring practices, in the way in which we teach, the form of curriculum we adopt. But here's where I'd like to sort of, I guess, tail off and close what I'm saying. We also came up against some significant obstacles that I'd like to put on the table for people to discuss. And that is one of the things that we wanted to do as a result and in response to the Black Lives Matter movement was to conduct a survey of members of our own department, which would ask them questions about racial identification and ethnicity, in order to be able to track at some level and in some way how our department was doing at various ranks, in its hiring practices, in its retention practices. And it's a standard form of research that has been done in the UK for many years, and I know also in the United States. And this image of this survey as a form of ethnic registration began to attract a lot of attention on social media, and particularly from members of the far right. And we experienced and were the victims of a profound, like an extended dismediation campaign, to try and present what we were doing, which we felt was an effort to address questions of diversity as an instance of racism. For those of you who don't know, are not familiar with the term dismediation, I think Maria Bustillos describes this in the following terms. Dismediation isn't discourse, it doesn't disinform, and it's not quite propaganda, as that term has long been understood. Instead, dismediation seeks to break the systems of trust without which civilized society hasn't got a chance. And we're familiar with this form of discourse and the way in which it plays out on Twitter. And what really disturbed us in this discussion is that many of our scholarly colleagues were participating in this process, right? Of continually labeling what we felt was an anonymous, self-identifying survey as something that was akin to the registrations of Jews during the Holocaust. Now, there was that form of problem which we encountered. And the problem that I felt and consistently struggled with is that we as scholars felt that we could engage with this mediation through scholarship, right? Through having the good argument, through participating in public debate, through trying to convince our interlocutors using evidence, facts, methods, whatever, the standard terms of public debate. And what we didn't realize is that we weren't participating in a debate. We were participating in a sphere that was turning increasingly violent as these myths about our department began to be utilized on social media to threaten members of our department in veiled and direct terms. Like, I would have the photos of myself and my children posted on various right-wing sites in response to our efforts to address questions of diversity in our department. Direct threats at our own safety. And what I found is that in this discussion, we had very few tools at our disposal to address these problems in terms of the ethics of how we worked on Twitter, and in terms of how our department would address when what we thought was a public sphere was actually turning into a realm of threats, violence, and intimidation. And I was extremely disappointed by members of my department who are unwilling to call that out, even when the same sorts of ideas that they were perpetrating were leading to these problems. What I was, though, and here I want to end on a hopeful note, is that what I was really encouraged by, and I'm going to use his name and their names directly in here, because these are the sorts of things that I think as scholars we need to think about as these debates move out of these nice closeted circles and into the public, was the efforts of other colleagues who I disagreed with to call out these instances of threats and violence and intimidation, and to do so in public and forceful terms. Tom Vandermeer, a colleague of mine in my department, John Green, people who I have profound disagreements on questions of diversity, were the first ones to call me and say, hey, this is wrong, this is out of line, and I'm going to say it, I'm going to report this to, on Twitter or in other environments. And I think those sorts of things and those sorts of efforts are the sorts of things that maintain this public discourse in a civil manner, and a way in which researchers can continue to have these sorts of discussions in terms that we feel like we have a voice, that where we have something that can change things, and in terms that we all recognize as valid and rational. Sorry, that's a little bit of a long one, but I got a lot to get off my chest with this one. I'll move it over to Leon, and you can pick it up from there.
Yeah. Leon? Thank you, Darshan, because I think many of us probably have shared the same type of experience in different countries. Leon?
Yeah, this is very interesting. I was really enjoying listening to your comments. Okay, so basically, I'm a bit cynical and I'm a bit jaded, as they say. And so I don't know, I don't like to make other people cynical, because sometimes you meet people who are optimistic and passionate, and they believe in things. And so I don't like to say too much about this, because I don't want to persuade you to have the same pessimistic outlook as I have with regards to fighting against injustice, racism, whatever. But what I'll just say is something about the Black Lives Matter movement, because I do have some kind of opinions about that, which are not really that popular, and to some people might also be controversial. So you might want to listen closely to this, because this is the kind of interesting comments that I'm about to say. So with regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, I think the problem is, sometimes we're debating the actual slogan, and sometimes we're debating the meaning of the slogan, and sometimes we're debating like the organization and the specific individuals that are associated with that organization. So there's different things going on, and these things usually don't get distinguished, and people conflate all of them. So we need to be clear about what we're talking about. I mean, obviously, if we're talking about like the literal slogan, Black Lives Matter, I mean, some people obviously say all lives matter, white lives matter. Some people say this or that matters. I mean, I guess, it's obvious that the term is supposed to refer to the idea that Black lives have not been treated as if they matter, and now we must recognize that they matter. But some people don't seem to understand that. But in its origin and in its ethos, I am, in agreement with the Black Lives Matter initiative. But the problem is, and this is the interesting point, is that somehow I feel as though the Black Lives Matter movement has been co-opted or appropriated in this year, 2020, well, last year, now we're in a new year, in 2020, it's been co-opted in a way where it's kind of like, I'm not sure if it's like, I can say it's losing its meaning, it's losing its radical message and call for change. It's being like, I'll give you an example of what I'm thinking about. I'm not sure if you're fans of football, but in the UK, obviously we have the Premier League, and I'm not sure if this is happening in other leagues, but in the UK, in the the football, even now that the Black Lives Matter hype has died down in most circles, before every match, or even at the beginning of every match, when they blow the whistle to start the match, all the players are kneeling down to like, I don't know, show allegiance with Black Lives Matter. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, some people might think that's great and, bring it on. We should have more of this. But part of me thinks like, what is okay, number one, is this achieving anything? Number two, do people understand what it's about? Is it like all the context and all the history and all the awkward and difficult baggage that goes along with trying to say that Black Lives Matter, is that really being paid attention to? Or is this just an empty gesture which is supposedly meaningful, but actually is being, the meaning is being diluted as a result of it being somehow like corporatized and made into this like PR stunt? So I feel a little bit, I felt bad for feeling like that last year because, as I said, I've been going on about racism and reading and thinking about racism for so many years. And then suddenly when 2020 is the year of everyone talks about racism, everyone's like condemning racism, I wasn't feeling happy about that. And I was saying to myself, that's weird. Why are you not feeling happy when you've been telling people we need to talk about this more and more? And I kind of realized that the reason I wasn't enjoying those discussions is because, like I said, I got the impression that many times those discussions were superficial and tokenistic and were just about trying to be in fashion and go with the times. And I knew that it wasn't going to last, and I knew that it would pass, and I knew that there'd be empty gestures, and I knew that not much would change. The other thing I'll say, and this is probably the final point, and I'll try and make it a kind of interesting one, and I think it's interesting because it's controversial again, is the other problem, if you like, that we've had as a result of Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people who, are kind of like on the same wavelength as me on many issues would disagree with me about this, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's something that I believe in. With regards to the Black Lives Matter, one of the problems that arise from it, because of the specific wording, because it's about Black lives and it's not about racism or racial minorities, people this idea already circulates, but it's been reinforced by the specifics of the slogan. People come to associate racism specifically with Black people, not with other minorities. And there are other minorities, of course, and there are other ways in which people are affected by racism. And of course, I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about Black people who experience racism. Of course, this is central to the understanding of racism. But we also can't talk about racism without talking about other groups who are not Black, who've suffered racism or forms of racism. So, for example, in an organization who were developing a anti-racist strategy, who asked me to read their anti-racist strategy, their emphasis was, or their definition they gave of racism was something that can affect Black people. And I explained to them, well, this is true, but there are also other minorities. And in particular, one of the concerns that I have is with regards to anti-East Asian racism or anti-Chinese racism, or xenophobia, some people call it. And the reason I was talking about that is, number one, I was writing an article about it at the time, but number two, because of COVID-19, at that time we were seeing people who were supposedly looking Chinese, they were being subject to violence, and they were being subject to discrimination, and they were being subject to insults and so on. So I was like, okay, what about that? Like, what about anti-Asian or anti-East Asian racism? You're not accounting for that. And their response was kind of a bit surprising for me, because their response was, well, yes, you're right, that is a form of racism, but at the moment, we're not really interested in that, and we'll come back to that later. And for me, that was not really the best approach, because my kind of perspective, like I said, some people will see this differently, but my perspective is like, you want to challenge racism, you can't just challenge racism towards one specific group. You have to challenge racism, which is a system which affects all different groups and all different victims. And as I said earlier, I mentioned like Islamophobia. My expertise and my research in the past has been about Islamophobia, and we've been, people like me who are interested in Islamophobia have been talking about it since 2001, 9/11. And it was weird in a way, because I kind of felt like we've been talking about this for like 20 years now, and suddenly like everyone suddenly like racism is coming to view. But where were all those people when Islamophobia was so rampant and so obvious and so clear in so many different spheres of society? And no one was really talking about, okay, people were talking about it, but it wasn't getting the attention that it deserved, even though we were seeing, we didn't see, I mean, the type of thing we saw with George Floyd was very unique and specific in that moment, but we saw other things which were horrendous, other types of extreme violence being directed towards Muslims, but people weren't talking about that and people weren't interested in that. So what my concern is, to summarize what I'm trying to get at, I'm trying to say that when it comes to racism, the problem with the Black Lives Matter slogan is it's, in my opinion, slightly misleading in not allowing us to appreciate that racism comes in many different shapes and sizes. It comes in its everyday microaggression form, comes in its institutional form. It's directed from different communities to different communities. And it isn't, the problem we have is we usually think of racism as like white to black. And this is part of the story, but the story is a lot more complicated. And if we really want to tackle racism, to go to the potential for change and you know, what can we contribute? We really want to tackle racism. Maybe this is what we as academics can do. Maybe we can try to provide a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of racism, because if we don't have that understanding of racism, then in my opinion, we're never going to be able to undo racism and dismantle racism, because we're always going to have a simplistic conception of a problem which is very complex.
Thank you, Leon. I must say that it resonates very much with our discussion within the group, because initially this group was called Black Lives Matter group, and there was a discussion, and precisely for the reason you mentioned, we prefer to talk about anti-racism at large. Because personally also I agree with you that it's a bit simplistic to look at the world as black and white. Things are more complicated than that. And the second point is that you talked about the cooptation. To some extent, maybe we can also talk about a kind of commodification of anti-racism as well. You know, suddenly all the major brands are anti-racist and make money with a slogan. And this, as academic, is something we should address as well. We have only a few minutes left before moving to the other part, but I would like to ask maybe just 2 comments or questions. The first 2 ones will be served. I don't see, is it? I see a hand is Chukaina. It's the first time I've seen, so.
Hi,
Hello.
this is Imiscoe. I would like to ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I just would like to ask the changes that we would see within the United States. Like first we had Trump coming to power and coming up with the travel ban, and with we could see the rise of the right wing in the United States. Do we see a correlation between Donald Trump in power and the rise of racism within Europe? And how would you see the changes within Europe that would happen after Joe Biden becoming the next president of the United States?
Leon Darshan, who wants to respond?
You can go first, Leon.
All right, thanks. That's very kind of you. Look, I'm glad that you asked that, Sakina, because I need to complete my point from the thing I was just previously talking about by saying that even though symbolic gestures are not what we really want, somehow they still have some benefit. And the benefit that they have is, to some extent, they can provide some kind of atmosphere or environment which can somehow tame the extent to which the racism or the prejudice is spreading. So what do I mean by that, and how does that relate to Trump? Okay, so some people say Trump, Biden doesn't matter, all the same. One of them is openly racist, and one of them, some people say one of them is openly aggressive or openly hostile, openly this to Muslims or others, and one of them is like that in their actions, you know, sort of like behind the scenes, or what they stand for or what they support. So I guess I would say there is some truth in that, in the sense that, you know, regardless of who's elected, there's going to be things that many people are not happy with how certain governments act and so on. But I would also say that when it comes to having somebody like Trump in office, it does enable people to be empowered, to feel empowered in the way in which they express their racism or their Islamophobia or whatever it is, their let's say, Mexican sentiment or even misogynistic sentiment or whatever else he stands for. So it does matter, in my opinion, these kind of the symbolism of Biden, if you like, of not being Trump, or the symbolism of Trump of standing for what he stands for and saying what he says. It does have an effect. It does trickle down and have an effect on what people do and how people behave. And of course, it has an effect in Europe because, like I said earlier, no one's living in Europe and Europe alone. No one's living in the UK and UK alone. What is happening in the US is affecting what is happening elsewhere, just as what is happening elsewhere is having an effect on the US. So I would say that whilst Trump is in office, there is a trickle-down effect, which is not going to have, which is empowering, emboldening, as they say, people to express racist views or views that are against particular minorities. Because when you see someone with power, when you see someone who's acting or saying certain things which resonates with particular far-right views, then of course people who hold those views secretly and privately or discreetly or in an anonymous space on social media, then they feel, as I said, more empowered to say that. And that's why, to some extent, even though I don't like symbolic gestures, I can see the logic of saying that symbolic gestures can also play a role in somehow, at least if they're not anti-racist, at least they're not pro-racist. So at least they don't enable racism. So in that sense, they're not as bad as you might think at first sight. Sorry, I'm waffling.
All right. If I could just jump in, Marco, quickly. Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that Leon is saying here, but I'd probably take another side of it, and that is to say that there's a profound abdication of responsibility for racism in Europe, which often involves allusion to the invention of racism in America and the invention of anti-racism in America. And I think that often is used as an excuse, particularly in the context of the Netherlands, as a reason for not engaging with the colonial past and the history of racism within Europe and its long history and its connection to contemporary forms of migration and discrimination. I'm hopeful that the transitions and changes that are occurring in the United States will maybe reflect an opportunity to utilize different forms of language in the ways in which we represent one another. But I just draw attention to the fact that we had one really important moment in the recent impeachment trial against Donald Trump. And it was I think the first time a member of the House of Congress on the floor has referred to him as a white supremacist. And she was black and she was booed. And the white member making the same claim was not booed, right? And so there are these huge tensions in this change and even within this transformation that I don't think are going to have any necessary outcomes in our context and in the context of anti-racism in Europe.
Thank you very much. I see there are lots of very interesting comments in the chat room, but just give the floor to Hans, and that will be the last comment or question before moving to the other countries. Thank you. Hans?
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I have a few comments to make based on the interesting points that Darshan was making about the Netherlands. And I first want to say I'm very sorry for the kind of accusations and the threats that he has to suffer from in the Dutch context. And this is very bad, of course, and I'm very sorry about that. The point I would like to make is that I would like to call for a more rigorous approach to the issues that we're talking about. And talking from the Dutch background, talking about race, ethnicity, and discrimination in one and the same breath, as if they were more or less the same issues, I think that's very complicated. That is very confusing, and that doesn't help very much in order to understand the problems of the people that we're talking about, especially in the Dutch case, that would be people with a migration background, the problems these people are facing. In the Dutch context, for instance, ethnicity and race have gone, after the war, have gone very separate ways. The terminology that Darshan was referring to, that has become official in the Netherlands since the 1980s, in order to ethnicize people with a migration background. This has been studied, this has been done by the Dutch government in a deliberate effort to avoid their racialization, just to indicate that race and ethnicity in the Netherlands have gone very different ways. The third concept, and also, I mean, racism and nationalism or ethnicity have very different institutional and historical backgrounds, and have very different ways in the ways in which they work out in practice. So I call for a clear conceptual separation between racism and nationalism, and therefore also with ethnicity in this case. The third concept, that is discrimination, we should not conflate discrimination with racism. As a scholar who has focused on discrimination in the Dutch labor market and in education for the last 20 years, we see, and that is also acknowledged by the Dutch government, that we have a huge problem regarding discrimination against people with a migration background in Dutch society. But there is hardly any evidence whatsoever that this discrimination would be connected somehow with racism. There are no indications, or there's no proof or evidence of racism whatsoever regarding, in its relevance regarding discrimination that people with a migration background suffer in the labor market. So we need a rigorous approach in order to come to understand and analyze the problems that we're talking about. And the book that was referred to by Claudia Wecker is exactly an example of how we should not do things, because her book has no definition of her central concepts whatsoever. It has only one small paragraph dedicated to methodological issues. She has no methodological justification of her book whatsoever. And it has very serious and sweeping statements regarding the Netherlands, but it provides no proof, no evidence, no data whatsoever. And contrary to what Darshan was saying about the Netherlands, it is perfectly possible to study these issues also from a statistical point of view. I've been doing this kind of work for the last 20 years, so it is perfectly possible.
Thank you very much for your comments. But remember that this is an introductory set of debates. We all agree that we need rigorous thinking about all that. But this is just the first round. Other events will come in order exactly to improve our knowledge and our discussions. So let's now turn to two other countries with different histories, who are often rivals in football. I know that Leon probably likes football as well. France and Italy, who are not always paired in discussion about racism and immigration. So to talk about France, we have Nina Sahraoui. She's a postdoc doctoral researcher at the Paris Center for Sociological and Political Research. It's a specific unit of the CNRS, and also associate researcher to the chair Exile and Migration at the Collège d'Études Mondiales, Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris. It is strange that it's still Maison des Sciences de l'Homme and not Maison des Sciences de la Femme. Maybe it will change in the near future. And we have for Italy, Alfredo Aglietti, who is a lecturer in urban sociology at the University of Ferrara, if I'm correct. And he's also a member of the Advanced Urban Marginality Network. And he's just published a few years ago or a month ago, I don't remember, a very big book on sociology of racism, I think, in Italy.
Yeah.
So you see, I'm informed. Huh? So the questions basically are the same, starting with history. What are the main historical elements underpinning race and racism in France and Italy? There are huge debate while we are talking about the use of the word race in France, what the historical explanation about all that? Sarah, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk about these issues from the French perspective or the French context. So from the historic kind of elements or background, of course, the first point is that the French Republic is well known for its officially colorblind stance. And I apologize if I say things that will be maybe quite obvious to many of you, but I still need to go back to a couple of points, and I wanted just first to mention a little bit on the historic construction of the French colorblind approach to race and racism in an attempt to illustrate how deeply it is ingrained in French politics, and then to mention some emerging research around the racialized politics of the French Republic that attempt to nuance the official historiography of the Republic. So first about this official doctrine. So a central official value of the French Republic is this abstract universalism that enshrines in law a general equality between citizens. And the celebrated version of the French Revolution foregrounds citizens' equality within the nation. And this is an equality that supposedly transcends any other form of belonging or affiliation to any group or community, hence also the negative connotation of the word community in French language. So any reference to specific identities, and especially racialized identities for that matter, is not only perceived as contradicting a fundamental Republican equality, it's also understood as endangering the very existence of the nation. And I think this notion of a threat to the nation and to the Republic as it stands is important because it helps accounting for the very deep polarization that characterizes the French public debate around these issues. And a perfect illustration of French Republican stance on race and racism is the erasure of the word race from the French Constitution. So it was first promised by François Hollande during the presidential campaign of 2012. It wasn't carried out under his mandate, but it was in 2018 under the current president, Emmanuel Macron. So basically the change concerned the first article of the French Constitution. It used to state France is an indivisible, secular, democratic, and social republic. It ensures the equality before the law of all citizens without distinction of origin, race, or religion. And the new version reads, it ensures the equality before the law of all citizens without distinction of sex, origin, or religion. So they took race out, they put sex in. So the only possible definition of race in this perspective is a biological one, and the erasure of the word race was part and parcel of the official and state-sponsored anti-racism. Since there are no biological races, the word cannot be used, and it would reproduce a category that is discriminatory in and of itself. And the claim that the Republic historically doesn't see race or color is contested, of course, by historians that are interested in the racialized politics of the Republic, and notably the historic period of the colonial Republic. So I would like here to refer to research by Nicolas Bancel, Pascal Blanchard, and Sandrine Lemaire, who have published an edited volume that was entitled La Fracture Coloniale, and then it was partly translated into English and expanded as well in a volume of a colonial legacy in France. And in their volume, they mention, for instance, the critique by historian Perry Anderson to the French well-known historian Pierre Nora for including only one mention of colonial history in his 7-volume encyclopedia of the places of remembrance that entails over 130 articles. So there exists in France a stream of research concerned with how certain dimensions of the colonial history of the Republic tend to be written off in the French Republican Roman National, or the official canonized version of the history of the Republic. And just to add to that, in a way, it's an obvious statement to observe that French universalist ideals had little to do with concrete politics of empire and colonization. but this is still easily swept away in contemporary political discourse, and this harks back to the ambiguities of the French Republican colonialism. So Republicans who carried out the colonial enterprise could simultaneously mobilize a universalist Republican ideology to justify the civilizing mission of France while implementing racialized hierarchies and distinction by casting colonized subjects as not yet ready to be emancipated. So I believe that this question of the colonial republic and how this historical period gets to be written and contested is important for contemporary debates around race and racism, because at the political level, what is possible still is only a commemorative or celebratory narrative. So Achille Mbembe writes about an active willingness to forget about French colonial past, which continues to really weigh heavily on the debates we are having around race and racism. I wanted also, I don't know if I still have the time, I wanted to mention very briefly also the how this question of the colonial history of the Republic is kind of on the political agenda in the news as well. So there was in 2020, in the wake of demonstrations against police violence, there was a debate that opened around these questions. And just to quote the President Emmanuel Macron very briefly, he stated around this issue, "We will be tough on racism, anti-Semitism and discrimination, and strong new decision will be taken. But this noble struggle is misguided when it turns into communitarism," so this idea that communities fragment the nation, "into a hateful or false rewriting of the past. This fight is unacceptable when it is instrumentalized by separatists. I'm telling you very clearly this evening, my dear compatriots, the Republic will not erase any trace or name from its history. The Republic will not take down any statue." So this is something that's still debated, and the complicated relationship of the Republic to its past hinders the contemporary debates we're having around race and racism in France.
Thank you, Nina. Well, in Italy too, there are problems with the past, and with the fact that there is racism. When in the end of the 80s, early 90s, when I was in Italy, there were all these debates, you know, is racism possible in Italy? And the common answer at the time was, no, it's not possible. We Italians are nice people. Racism cannot be. How is it going in Italy? What's the legacy of the specific history, Alfredo?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the previous presentations. Very, very good. It's very, very important for us. It's not simple. You know, the Italian case is always a special case. It's a strange case. Also for the recent political situation, it's not so simple to talk about the Italian case. But the historical term is very important to understand the situation in Italy, because the legacy of anti-Semitism and colonialism during the fascism is a fundamental point for understanding the contemporary racism in Italy. I would like to highlight that one big problem, one specific problem in historical and cultural debate, because just only in a recent decade, with a few significant exceptions, some exceptions, there has been a critical reflection on the colonialism and the fascist racial laws in 1938 as an element, central element, characterizing the Italian history and its influence on the current far-right political configuration. It is a very focal point in the historical and cultural debate in Italy. So another important question is from a historical point of view, the Italian society was already crossed by a strong anti-Jewish ideology and rhetoric promoted by the Catholic culture and racist ideology linked to the colonial adventure in the late 19th century. And the third focal point is another important point for Italian case is a strong anti-Southernism in Italy. It's a very, very important question. This is a further historical and cultural aspect that accompanied the construction of Italian nation. The anti-Southernism is a focal point for the construction of Italy like a nation. This is a really important point for me, in my opinion. And I remember this anti-Southernism is based for the birth of the Northern League in Italy in 19 years. So I think it's important to underline the question that called Marco. When there is in Italy the myth of representation and self-absolutory myth of the Italians like good people, very good people. This is a rhetoric based on a sort of bland racism. Bland now is not so strong racism or not so strong anti-Semitism compared with the Nazist experience of genocide and so on. And the last question about the historical roots of the contemporary political situation is the neo-fascist movement now in Italy implements a strategy of revitalizing the typical racist rhetoric like folk and blood, strong national identity, and xenophobic practices and discourses, and supporting also the most reactionary.
Sorry, Alfredo, can you get closer to the microphone? We don't always hear you well.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Now,
that's fine. Yes.
Hear better now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I am saying about the question of the far-right movements now in Italy. That is implement a strategy of justification of revitalizing the typical racist rhetoric, the typical fascist and racist rhetoric, for example, folk and blood, strong national identity, and xenophobic practices and discourses in public opinion. It's very important to highlight this question about the far-right movement in Italy, because, for example, in the street you can see on the wall the typical iconographic fascist iconographic, for example, I don't know, the iconographic of against black people, against the violence of black people against wife, against Italian women. Or also another important bill that you can see in Italy is from far-right movement is against the abortion with the typical Italian mother is from fascist iconography. So I think it's, the historical debate in Italy is now is not so strong in academic Italian context, because it's not so widespread, the debate in academic world. But I think in the future, I hope that this question can be a main element for the student, for all the world academic, and not only the academic world, but also in Italian society.
Thank you, Alfredo. Nina, if we go to the theoretical and public debates in France about race and racism, living in a neighboring country, it's quite amazing how you have, on the one hand, a debate dominated by people like Éric Zemmour, one of the most popular TV person in France, and a kind of sort of criminalization of all the scholars, for example, who try to raise the issue of race and racism in French society, with strong attacks as people being a threat to the Republic, and even worse than that, people really wanted to kill the wonderful idea of the French Republic. Is the debate as polarized as that? Is it? What are the terms of the debate? Is it possible today to speak about racism in French academia, for example?
Exactly, as you have described, it's a very polarized debate, and there are deep running tensions around both the theoretical and public debates. There is an interdependence, of course, between the spheres around race and racism. So academic events can get caught up in political polemics very quickly, and political events also trigger debates and polemics that often involve academics with opposing views. So actually the national press publishes articles, op-eds, opinion pieces around these issues on a very regular basis. But the media coverage of the debate also feeds in a way in the reproduction of partial or caricatural arguments that engender further polarization of these different positions, and I was under the impression that this leaves quite a little space for constructive debates. And the questions that are particularly polemic and recurrent concern the institutional or systemic nature of racism, and in particular the use of expressions such as state racism or institutional racism, and the reference to racialized identities. So in addition, also, there are a couple of concepts that have come to symbolize this divide between researchers who, on the one hand, will engage with notion of race, racialization, intersectionality, or post-colonial, decolonial studies, and on the other, scholars who accuse this strand of research of, as you have mentioned, demeaning the Republican values. So to summarize the terms of the debate, researchers who engage with this concept, race, racialization, institutional racism, Islamophobia as well, they are accused of applying a racial lens onto social issues and of reproducing racist categories. So what we found in a newspaper quite often is, for example, the phrase racist anti-racism to attack academics. They are also being accused of threatening Republican values by fragmenting the French nation and society, as mentioned. And the idea here is that identity politics are fundamentally at odds with Republican universalism. They are also accused of being obsessed with race and the legacy of colonialism while ignoring class, which some believe should take precedence over race and gender. And a specific strand of this critiques focuses on post-colonial and decolonial studies, and very often they are grouped together, brushing over the different genealogies and specificities, etc. And this kind of whole subfields are accused of instigating hatred against the Western world, against the French Republic, or against the white men. So there are different variations of this type of critiques. And finally, most of these critiques claim that researching race, racialization, and racism is a foreign import, so mostly a US import that does not have any relevance in the French context and only risk the racialization of social issues. So these are kind of the tropes of the critiques that are reproduced in the media around this polemics, and there are really plenty of examples that we could take to illustrate that. I only mentioned the most recent issue that involves statement by the president and some ministers, and gave way to a series of articles in the media as well around race-related research at at universities. So what happened recently, a few months ago in June 2020, in the wake of the protests against police brutality, the French president Emmanuel Macron stated, "The academic world has been guilty. It encouraged the ethnicization of the social issue, thinking it was a good theme. However, the outcome can only be secessionist. It amounts to breaking the republic in two." So we can see really the degree of politicization around these issues is very high in France, and kind of in the same vein, but in a different context. A few months later, in October 2020, in the wake of the terrorist assassination of the teacher Samuel Paty, the French education minister blamed universities for spreading what he called an Islamo-leftist ideology. So following that, there was 100 of researchers who signed an op-ed in support of the minister, and they called for engaging, quote, "our universities in this fight for secularism and the republic by creating a body responsible for directly reporting cases of violations of republican principles and academic freedom," unquote. And so in response to that, there was another letter signed by around 2,000 academics who denounced, quote, "the McCarthyist curtailment of the university, which would involve subjecting it to political control that would verify the loyalty of teachers to the state." So really, the debate got so politicized that there was even an instance of kind of controlling and checking what was going on at the university was debated. So to say the least, both theoretical and public debates around race and racism and various fields of studies are very heavily charged with meaning in the French context, and the ongoing politicization of academic research threatens its independence.
Thank you, Nina. How is it in Italy? Has Salvini and his supporters managed to control the public debate? And how do academics respond? What's the tone of the academic debate on racism in Italy, if there is one?
Yeah, of course, Marco. I think the debate in academia is strongly present. We have a lot of scholars and researchers, but for example, we have not so many academic courses on racism, decolonization, and so on. And so I hope in the future, as I recall before, there will be a greater presence of academic courses on these topics. I agree with Leon. We have now an extensive knowledge on racism, xenophobia at every level of Italian society, but this is the impact on society, widespread society, is very weak. So it's difficult to build a counter narrative able to change the situation, the condition. This is very, very important for all us. I try to explain you some important content of the social and academic debate in Italian case. The first one is the process of the humanization of the foreign migrant refugees and so on, joined with the construction of moral panic, particularly in the case of an asylum seeker and overall the Muslim community. This very paranoid debate about Islam and Muslim communities now in Italy. Another important question is the mass media and the public opinion. Often we can find the overlapping among asylum seeker refugees and the Islamization of Italian country. And the threat of terrorism is another important question I think, around different European countries. We have an important question promoted by Salvini, but not only Salvini, also the brother of Italy, the second far-right parties in Italy, is the rhetoric of progressive ethnic substitution of by uncontrolled migration. We have now in Italy is important, is very dangerous debate about the criminalization of democratic civil society, NGOs, and the most progressive part of Catholic Church, including the figure of Pope, accusing him to strongly involved in the integration, interfaith dialogue with Islam community. I think it's this criminalization of NGOs, criminalization of civil society, the progressist civil society, I think it's a very important point for debating the characterization of Italian case when we discuss about the racism and the racialization dynamics in Italy now. I think it's another point. I think it's common with other experience in Europe. Is the xenophobic common sense? The xenophobic common sense. Is we now in Italy there is not the covert racism. It's really open racist expression in the public opinion. This is very, very dangerous for the democratic issues, the democratic situation in Italy, because it's not more the classical phrase like I am not racist, but now in Italy it's normal to say I am a racist. This is change. We now assist a great change in the discussion, in the presentation of the racist attitude and the racist opinion. I think it's very, very important to discuss about this problem, this question. I think another important point, in my opinion, always in my opinion, of course, is we assist production of ignorance. There is a sort of strategy for production of ignorance about the main question about migration, about racism, about racialization in Italy. And it is important to say the question about the social media, the social network, and so on. The presence of far-right movement, far-right political actors in the social media in Italy is really strong. This is really a big problem. I think so. And another, the last two questions is the one is the dynamic of tabloidization of political discourse. It provided to build a favorable discursive opportunity structure for the racist discourses in public opinion and for hegemony, a sort of hegemony of racist political and societal discourses. And so I think the last question is, I think is now we have to fight the crisis of political representation. I think now in Italy there is a strong crisis of democracy, and so it's I think this question is a basis for it's called by some scholars generalized resentment. This generalized resentment is the strong basis of consensus to racism and Islamophobia, anti-Semitism in minimal part now in Italy. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Alfredo. Moving quickly to the issue of data and methodology, Nina, we know that there are historical resistances to register, to take into account race and ethnicity in national statistics, but also in survey. There have been debates, and there are researchers who are trying to build statistics that would help us to monitor the evolution of racial and ethnic discrimination. Can you tell us where the debate is now?
Yes, exactly. So the starting point is the fact that that ethnic statistics, as a general rule, are forbidden, which follows from the colorblind ideology, obviously. But it doesn't mean that no survey at all are conducted, obviously. But what happens is that mostly the only concept that official statistics can work with is national origin. So there are statistics that are broken down by country of birth. And then as a proxy category for rationales minorities, there is a category of persons defined by the country of birth of the parents. So I guess this resembles what has been discussed earlier around of immigration background for the Netherlands. So the biggest study that kind of addressed this question of discrimination was conducted in 2008. It was called Origins and Trajectories. It included over 20,000 persons, and it concluded to the existence of widespread discrimination in different social fields, employment, health, etc. But actually that survey did not collect subjective data as to one's own identity. They worked with the classical usual category of origins, and I believe they kind of trying to have a second edition of that survey now. But in addition to that, there are plenty of smaller quantitative and qualitative studies that attest to the existence of pervasive discrimination on the labor market or by the police or in accessing healthcare. So one of the methods is testing, of course, and research that resorted to this method of testing usually concludes to significant discrimination on the labor market. There was one quite big study published last year based on over 17,000 fictitious applications that concluded that there is significant discrimination against those who have a last name that sounds North African. And this discrimination was carried out by big companies, and particularly the biggest companies. But testing usually is only used for labor market and employment. So this is one of the important limits. And then we have a range of qualitative studies that touch upon the question of discrimination by the police in schools or at work. And I guess kind of a turning point or the emergence of that field can be situated with an edited volume in 2006 by Eric Fassin and Didier Fassin, when they had a volume entitled From the Social to the Racial Question? And then there are a couple of books and volumes that followed that. There is one that was published last year by Omar Slaughty and Olivier Lecourt-Grandmaison, Racisme de France, which also kind of addresses the question of racist discrimination in different social fields, from education to the police, etc. So basically, to sum up, there is incidental evidence that's readily available, but there are no real tools that can be mobilized on a broader scale to monitor racist discrimination. And this, of course, leads to the fact that there is an important gap between the academic world and public policymaking around these issues.
Mm-hmm. Alfredo, how is it in Italy? What type of data can you rely on, and what type of methodologies do you use to document discrimination?
Yeah. This is for Italy is a very important question. It's a crucial question because Italy does not have an official and systematic record of the xenophobic attitude or specific racist events inside society. This is a very big problem for Italian society, for Italian racism, knowledge on the racism in Italy. There are some NGOs like Amnesty International and so on, anti-racist association like Lunaria. It's very important. Anti-racist association is very, very strong at the local level that collected data from different sources, mainly from the mass media or social media, for example, Facebook and Twitter. We have also the very important independent research center like Imiscoe or Chances, other independent institute for research that use direct sources by the ad hoc survey, opinion polls, and so on. Or it's important Eurobarometer secondary data analysis. This is important for knowledge of the racism and the discrimination. The National Statistics Office collects data on attitude towards migrants, but it's not systematic, it's not continuous. The last important research from National Statistics Office is the 2012, so it's not so recent. Important issues, critical issues in Italy, that the lack of official data on hate crimes and religious crimes in Italy. This represents another important deficit for understand the discrimination and racism events, hate crimes in Italy. We have the main official source of data about discrimination, hate crimes, is the Observatory for Security Against Discriminatory promoted by Minister of Interior, but it's largely insufficient and not continuous. Sometimes we collect some data, but it's not so systematic, so strong. And also is an important question, is not exhaustive of phenomenon. And based only, the most part is based only on anonymous warning from individual, single individual, or from NGOs. So this is, I think, is in Italy is not so good. The database about the hate crimes, discrimination, and racism. This is a really big problem. It's a crucial issue for the future in Italy.
Thank you. So, like I did in the first round, I would like to finish with giving the floor to both of you on the three last questions. You know, say what you think is most relevant about the impact of Black Lives Matter. I probably guess it has been smaller in Italy than in France, but also what potential you see for change in the near future, and what role can we play, us as academics, in the middle of the pack to try to push society towards a more, I would say, open and less racist development. Nina, are you pessimistic, optimistic, or cynical, as Leon was saying before?
I guess both in a way. It's hard to be entirely optimistic, but I think it's necessary. I'll try to kind of summarize the points I had in mind, not to be too long. But yeah, around the social movements and Black Lives Matter, So of course there was a very important resonance in the French context, and especially around a key actor around this mobilization called the Comité Adama, that's led by Assa Traoré, who's the sister of Adama Traoré, so a young Malian man who died in police custody 4 years ago in 2016. And even at that time, they already used the Black Lives Matter France hashtag, but it really resonated even more importantly last year in 2020 with big demonstrations in Paris in June, over 20,000 persons for the first demonstration, also around 50,000 persons for the second demonstration in June. So there was a very strong mobilization in the wake of the death of George Floyd. In terms of potential for change, I guess that even if we are also witnessing a sort of backlash, in the past 2 decades, we have seen also a renewal of political mobilization by racialized minorities in the fight against racism. So there was the famous grassroots mobilization of the 1980s, and notably the Marche des Beurs of 1983. But to some extent, these grassroots mobilizations of the early 80s were co-opted by the Socialist Party with the creation of this mainstream anti-racist organizations that defended the Republican version of the color black ideology. And we have seen since the 2000s new organizations that emerge and that transform this landscape of anti-racism, and they provide a political platform to the voices of those who are directly affected by racism. And it's not only the 2000s, it's also the 2010s, because this landscape remains dynamic. A feminist Muslim NGO was recently created, also a Black feminist organization, and they attracted many activists. So the field of the social movements is really quite dynamic. And coming to the research community and the role of researcher, particularly in the French context, I believe that the research community has a role to play in demonstrating that these questions are not a foreign import, that researchers in France have been concerned with questions of racism and have developed their own intersectional tools of analysis for decades as well. For example, Colette Guillaumin published in 1972 in France a book called The Racist Ideology. She used the notion of racialization. She also advanced the theorization of gender oppression, and her contributions were already in many ways intersectional. And in her wake, others have critically examined racialized and gendered forms of domination. So I believe that this scholarly historiography is very important to debunk the myth of this allegedly US imported school of thought without relevance to the French history or context. Yeah, some researchers have also illustrated that even the phrase state racism has been used since the 1980s in the media. But yeah, I'm gonna kind of summarize that point here, just to mention the last point I wanted to make around the role of a community of researchers. Because of the context that I have described earlier, the polarization and politicization of this debate, research that engages with race and racism in France, for this type of research, the scope for the research community to share the terms of the public debate is quite limited in a way. So that's kind of a pessimistic view. Because of the absence of any kind of institutionalization, which means that there is actually little space to research these issues. Most contributions are the result of individual projects or small-scale collaborations. But it's also why it's absolutely key to have a less hostile environment. And by a less hostile environment, I mean a certain normalization of racism studies or post-colonial studies, something that gender studies only begin to timidly achieve in the French context, but that would be kind of a direction. And I believe that achieving a less hostile environment is necessary for the research community to contribute positively and in a constructive manner to the public debate, and potentially also to more inclusive rather than divisive policy making.
Thank you, Nina. Very important points, and especially the last one. Sometimes I'm struck by the violence in French academia, where it's becoming very, very difficult to disagree. I mean, you know, in an academic debate, and the tension is really too high, I think. And I trust that there are many, the vast majority of academics would like to restore a kind of, you know, dialogue. And, you know, it's nice to disagree in academic debates. That's how we progress. And I think that it's really an important point. Also, if we want to be more influent in society, we have to show that. And this is probably valid in France and in other countries. So in Italia, Alfredo, how do you see things moving, changing in terms of struggle against racism and so on?
Yeah, I am not so optimistic, but I think it's possible to create the condition for a real change. But the impact, for example, the impact of Black Lives Matter has been significant in Italy. It's not so because there have been different manifestations in a lot of cities in Italy during this spring, and then 20 cities from the north to the south of Italy, and there has been a widespread debate in mass media, on mainstream mass media, on legacy of colonialism. And the contemporary racism, institutional racism in Italian society. This is, I think, this is an important aspect of the impact of the influence of Black Lives Matter inside the Italian anti-racism movement. But sorry, and another important question, I think, is the content of the demonstration, and the main actor of this demonstration is one important, so important point is the role of young leader Afro descendants, especially women, no? And the strong presence of young people in this demonstration across Italy. This is really, really important, because the voice of the young Afro-descendants and the voice of migrants is very, very important in Italian debate inside the society. And I think it's a very, very important question. The main content of the demonstration is one important, is the reform of citizenship to introduce the so-called the jus cultura, a weak form, a weak model of jus soli for the young people with migrant background of so-called second generation. This is a really important question in Italy. This is very, very crazy situation about this the reform of citizenship for young people with migrant background. And then another question in sectionality of the question, the gender and racism is really important question during this demonstration based on the Black Lives Matter experience. Another important question is the racial exploitation of migrant farm workers living in the rural ghetto areas in the south of Italy. And another fundamental question is the amendment of security decrees of Salvini against NGOs, refugees, and migrants, and so on. But there is always no, the term "but" when we discuss about this important question. I quote just a few. I quote some words from a young Afro-descendant woman, a leader of this manifestation in Milan, and she said, in fact, there is not even a Black Lives Matter movement in Italy. The issues in Italy cannot be treated with the same filter as the USA. There are certain points in common, but here we are still at the starting point. A society in which not even a cultural decolonization has taken place. Think of the trivialization of colonial history, stereotypes and prejudice about black bodies and more. As for institution, I only see a lot of rhetoric, but few facts and change. So I think it's the better way to to show you the situation of crisis of anti-racism and in Italy. I think it is important that we have something that some input to change in Italy, but I think it's not so simple. We have in Italy a lot of difficulties to change the situation, to create the condition for a counter hegemony of xenophobic and racist discourse in political and discourse and inside the Italian society. But we hope that it change. Always say we have to hope for the future.
Thank you, Alfredo, also for bringing in the issue of citizenship, which is specific compared to the other three countries we discussed today. My daughter is born in Belgium. She doesn't speak Italian. She's Italian automatically. A young child born in Italy in a Moroccan or Senegalese family who speaks perfect Italian, who knows only Italy, is not an Italian. And this is just not possible. And it reflects, in my view, what we can call state racism, clearly.
So just one thing, but also the weakness of left-wing parties in Italy, the weakness.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So time is up, but to be fair, I opened the floor in the first round. Maybe I can take one or two questions for the road. We have lost a few participants, which is normal after 2 hours. If there are people who want to say something, now is the moment. If not, we will conclude. Okay, if there's nobody, again, this was a first seminar. There are many issues we have not considered, and in the comments I see many people saying that there are other topics we should address. For example, racism also in academic institutions. We are well aware of that, but this was a first event for us. At least we proved that we can listen to each other and respect each other's views. And I think this is important, and it will be also underlined for next event. We can disagree, but we have to remain polite and, and respectful of our colleagues. And that's been very largely the case today. So again, thank you, Imiscoe. Thank you, Parvati.
Thank you very much.
All of you. Alfredo,
Thank you
Nina,
very much.
Leon,
Thank you.
and looking
Speakers.
forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Is it so, or 3 weeks' time? I don't remember. So thank you very much, and have a very nice weekend, and take care of you as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good luck.
you very
Bye-bye.
much,
Bye.
Thanks, Marco, very
Thank
much.
you, Parvati.
And the next session is on February 12th at the same
Okay.
time. And we will be discussing Poland, Hungary, Sweden, Switzerland. A really fantastic set of discussions. So particular thanks to all the speakers as well. Huge thanks, Marco.
Thank you.
And
Thank
as
you.
well, organization. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.